She was 17, young, beautiful, a high school senior with dreams bigger than the city she grew up in. She wanted to be a nurse, to help people, to heal. She had a laugh that could light up a room, a heart too big for the world she lived in. And she believed in love, the kind of love that is promised forever. He was 18, a star athlete, the kind of boy mothers warned their daughters about. Too charming, too smooth, too good at making you feel special. But she saw something different in him. He told her she was the only one, that no one would ever love her the way he did, that he'd never hurt her. If you are not an advocate of domestic violence, murder, inhumanity, abuse to mention a few, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications for more true crime stories. But love should never make you afraid. Love should never make you question your worth, second-guess your instincts, or walk on eggshells, hoping today won't be the day he changes. Keisha Monroe didn't know that yet. She didn't know that love, real love, doesn't come with conditions, with possessiveness disguised as protection, with anger masked as passion. She didn't know that confronting a lie could cost her everything. She found the messages, the pictures, the late-night phone calls he thought she'd never see, and suddenly, the boy who swore she was his world had another girl wrapped in his arms. It hurt. Of course it did. But Keisha wasn't the type to stay silent. She wasn't the type to look the other way. She was strong, she had a voice, and she was going to use it. So she called him. She told him they needed to talk, face to face, no lies, no excuses. He said he'd meet her. Told her she was being dramatic, overreacting, that it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, that she was still his girl. She didn't believe him, but she still went. She checked her phone, 10:42 p.m. He was late, typical, but she waited anyway, because part of her still wanted to believe. Part of her thought maybe, just maybe, he'd apologize, that he'd say he was sorry, that he'd be the boy she fell in love with just one more time. The car pulled up, headlights off, slow, too slow. The window rolled down, his face was blank, cold, not the boy she thought she knew. And before she could say his name, before she could ask why, he pulled out a gun. One shot, then another, and another. Not two, not 5, not 10. 22 bullets. 22 times he pulled the trigger. 22 reasons she never made it home. Beat. Silence. Then the distant sound of sirens growing louder, closing in, but too late. This isn't just another tragic love story. This is a warning. A story of obsession, betrayal, and the deadly cost of loving the wrong person. Her name was Keisha Monroe, and this is how she died. Keisha Monroe and Jamal have been together for nearly 2 years. Young love, intense and intoxicating. The kind of love that made you feel like nothing else in the world mattered. To their friends, they were inseparable. Cute. Goals. The perfect couple. But love has layers, and what was visible on the surface wasn't the full story. Keisha was happy. At least that's what she told herself. But even the brightest love stories can have shadows creeping in the corners. And in the weeks leading up to that night, those shadows started growing. Messages on his phone, calls at odd hours, a sudden shift in how he treated her, less patience, more excuses, more "I was busy," less "I love you." And then, proof. Keisha wasn't the type to go through her boyfriend's phone. She believed in trust, but something was off. The way he started pulling away, the way he'd turn his phone face down when they were together, the way he smiled a little too long when certain girls passed by. And one night when his phone buzzed while he was in the shower, curiosity got the best of her. She picked it up. The name on the screen wasn't hers. And the message? It wasn't friendly. "Can't wait to see you again." Her heart stopped. Her hands shook. She scrolled, reading through message after message. It wasn't just one girl. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern, a trail of lies. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing. She felt sick. She felt betrayed. And most of all, she felt angry. She could have stayed silent, let it eat away at her, pretended she didn't see it. But that wasn't who Keisha was. She wasn't weak, she wasn't naive, she wasn't going to let herself be disrespected. She waited, kept the anger bottled up, let the night pass. The next day she acted normal, smiled when she saw him, kissed him on the cheek when he met her at school, but inside, she was burning. She knew what she had to do. She needed to confront him, face to face, no lies, no excuses. So she called him, told him they needed to talk. He was defensive from the start, brushing it off, calling her crazy, told her she was overreacting, told her she was being dramatic. But Keisha wasn't one to be silenced. She told him to meet her in person, that she wanted the truth, that she deserved it. He hesitated, but then he agreed, said he'd pick her up, said they'd talk, said he loved her. But love doesn't come with conditions. Love doesn't kill. The air felt heavier that night, thick with something unspoken. Keisha sat in her room staring at her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone. Her fingers hovered over Jamal's name. Her heart was pounding, but not from love, not this time. It was something else, something colder, something final. She pressed the call button. 1 ring, 2, 3. Then his voice, groggy, annoyed. What? She swallowed hard. We need to talk. A pause. The sound of movement on the other end. He was thinking, calculating. About what? You know what? Silence. And then a forced chuckle. Keisha, you tripping. I don't got time for this. Her grip tightened around the phone. Then make time. I'm not playing, Jamal. Meet me tomorrow, in person. Another pause. He sighed, long and drawn out, like she was exhausting him. Like she was the problem. Fine. 1 word. Cold. Detached. Not the Jamal she had known. Not the boy who once swore he'd love her forever. But she wasn't speaking to that version of him anymore. That boy didn't exist. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside her window. Her mind replayed everything. Every moment, every word, every sign she had ignored. She told herself this was closure, that after tomorrow she'd be free, that once she had the truth she could finally move on. But the truth wasn't going to set her free. The truth was going to bury her. Morning came too soon. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. Keisha got dressed in silence. Simple jeans, a hoodie, sneakers she could run in. Not that she knew why that mattered. Maybe some part of her already knew. She checked her phone, 1 unread message. Be outside in 5. No, good morning. No heart emoji, just that, 5 minutes. The seconds crawled by. Then headlights through her window, a car idling at the curb. She grabbed her bag, took one last look at her room, and walked out the door. Jamal was waiting. He didn't get out of the car, didn't smile, didn't greet her. Just sat there, one hand gripping the wheel, the other tapping against his thigh. Agitated, restless. She opened the door, slid into the passenger seat. The door shut behind her with a finality she didn't understand until it was too late. The car pulled off. The city blurred past. Familiar streets, now foreign. The air between them was thick, suffocating. She broke the silence first. Who is Shanice? His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the wheel. Why you always gotta start something? Her voice didn't shake. I saw the messages, Jamal, don't lie to me. A sharp inhale, a slow exhale, and then he laughed. A short, humorless sound. You went through my phone? That's all you have to say? His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. You know what your problem is, Keisha? You don't know when to shut up. She felt it then. The shift. The danger. The way the space between them had changed. This wasn't just a fight. This was something else. Something darker. She reached for the door handle. It was locked. Keisha Monroe had walked into that car thinking she was going to get answers. She didn't know she had just stepped into her own grave. Keisha wrapped her arms around herself, more from instinct than from cold. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. But something in the air felt different. Charged. like the moment before a storm. She stopped a few feet away, waiting for him to speak first. He didn't. Just stared at her, jaw tight, eyes dark. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Why, Jamal?" He exhaled sharply, shook his head like she was wasting his time. "Why what?" Her voice didn't waver. "Why did you cheat on me?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance, irritation, maybe even amusement. Man, here we go again. Keisha's fingers curled into fists. "Don't do that. Don't act like I'm crazy. I saw the messages, the pictures. I know." For a moment he said nothing, then he scoffed, pushing off the car. "You're tripping. Those messages don't mean nothing." She let out a bitter laugh. "You really expect me to believe that?" He stepped closer, too close. "Believe what you want." The way he said it, so casual, so dismissive. It was like she was nothing. Like their 2 years together had been nothing. Her heart pounded, but she held her ground. "So you're not even gonna try to lie? Not even gonna pretend to be sorry?" His eyes flashed. "For what? For texting some girls? You acting like I did something crazy. You need to chill." "I loved you, Jamal," she whispered. "I would have done anything for you." Something in his expression shifted. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. "And I told you, I don't got time for this drama." Drama. That's what he called it. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, just drama. Something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to cry, she wasn't going to beg. She had come here for the truth, and now she had it. "I'm done," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'm done with you, with your lies, with all of it." She turned to leave. And that's when she heard it. A sharp intake of breath. The scrape of his shoes against the pavement, and then, "You think you're done with me?" She froze. His voice was low, dangerous. It didn't sound like him, not the Jamal she had known, not the boy she had fallen in love with. This voice belonged to someone else, someone she didn't recognize. Slowly, she turned back. "What did you just say?" He took a step closer, then another. His hands were no longer in his pockets. His fists were clenched at his sides. "You don't get to leave me, Keisha." Her breath hitched. A cold realization washed over her. This wasn't about love, it never had been. This was about control. She took a step back. He took another forward. "Jamal, you're scaring me." His laugh was hollow. "Good." She turned on her heel, ready to run, ready to get as far away as possible, but then, a sharp yank, a rough grip on her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin like iron claws. "You're not walking away from me," he hissed. She struggled, trying to pry herself free. "Let me go, Jamal." But he wasn't listening. His grip tightened. His breathing was uneven, ragged. His entire body was trembling with something dark, something violent, something that had been buried for too long. A car drove by, slowed down. A couple walking their dog glanced in their direction. For a split second, Jamal loosened his hold, just enough for Keisha to yank her arm away. She stumbled back, heart racing. "We're done, Jamal. Stay away from me." He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. And then, quietly, he said it. "You think you can just leave me?" The way he said it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She turned and walked away, forcing herself not to run, forcing herself to keep her head high. She didn't see his hands shaking. She didn't see the fury boiling beneath his skin. She didn't hear the words he whispered under his breath. "If I can't have you, no one will." The night air was still. The city hummed in the distance, but here, in this quiet stretch of the neighborhood, everything felt frozen, suspended, waiting. Keisha's footsteps were quick, her breath uneven. She didn't run. She wouldn't run. She refused to give Jamal that satisfaction. But her hands were shaking, her pulse pounded in her ears. She could feel his eyes on her. She could feel the weight of his stare burning into her back like a brand. She was almost to the sidewalk, almost to the street where the lights were brighter, where people were nearby. Safety was just a few steps away. Then she heard it. The sound of fabric rustling, a sharp inhale, and then, Keisha. She turned. A glint of metal in the dim light, the shape of something in his hand, something small, something cold. A gun. Her breath caught, her body stiffened, the world tilted. Jamal! He raised the gun. She didn't even get to scream. The first shot hit her in the shoulder. White-hot pain exploded through her body. Her knees buckled. She gasped, stumbling backward, her hand clutching the wound, warm blood spilling between her fingers. Another shot. Her stomach. The impact sent her crashing to the pavement, her vision blurring. Then another. And another. Neighbors heard the first shot, then the second. Someone screamed. A porch light flickered on. A dog barked wildly in the distance. But Jamal didn't stop. He stood over her, his face blank, empty, the same way he had looked at her in the car, the same way he had looked at her when she said she was done. Another shot, then another, then another. The bullets tore through her, arms, legs, chest. Each one met with a sickening thud. Blood pooled beneath her, seeping into the cracks of the sidewalk, staining the concrete a deep, unforgiving red. The neighborhood wasn't quiet anymore. Someone was shouting, a man yelling for him to stop, a woman sobbing, her voice shaking as she fumbled to dial 911. But Jamal wasn't listening. He kept pulling the trigger. 17, 18, 19. Keisha's body jerked with each shot, but she had stopped moving, stopped fighting. 20, 21, and then 22. Jamal stood there, breathless, the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. For a moment, everything felt unreal. The weight of the gun in his hand, the scent of gunpowder in the air, the way Keisha's body lay still, so still, eyes half open but unseeing. He had done it. She was gone. The reality slammed into him like a tidal wave. His chest heaved, his hands trembled. The gun slipped from his grip, clattering onto the pavement beside her. Then panic. A flash of red and blue lights in the distance, the wail of sirens cutting through the night. Footsteps pounding down porches, voices yelling, phones recording. Jamal turned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to go. Now. He ran. Keisha Monroe lay motionless, her once vibrant world fading to darkness. A neighbor dropped to their knees beside her, pressing shaking hands to her wounds, whispering prayers between sobs. But it was too late. Much too late. The sirens wailed through the quiet Houston night, flashing red and blue lights splashing against houses and parked cars. Neighbors stood frozen on their porches, eyes wide, hands clutched over their mouths. Some whispered in shock. Others turned away, unable to look at the tragedy unfolding just feet from their homes. The officers moved fast, securing the scene, their radios crackling with urgent voices. But there was no need for paramedics to rush. No need for CPR, no need for life-saving measures. Keisha Monroe was already gone. Her body lay motionless on the pavement, surrounded by a pool of deep crimson. 22 shots, too many wounds to count. Her once bright future, erased in an instant. One officer knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck, more out of procedure than hope. When he felt nothing, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head at his partner. No pulse. No life. A detective arrived moments later, stepping out of his car, his face set in a grim expression. He had seen murder scenes before, but this was something else. This was rage. This was personal. "Do we have a suspect?" he asked, scanning the shocked faces of bystanders. A woman, middle-aged, still in her nightgown, stepped forward, her voice shaking. It was him, that boy, her boyfriend, Jamal Carter. The detective's eyes darkened. Jamal Carter. It didn't take long to put the pieces together. A name that had already been whispered among the officers, a name that came up more than once as neighbors began sharing what they knew. And what they knew was disturbing. Keisha's best friend, Tasha Williams, arrived at the scene not long after, barely able to stand when she saw the body. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke to officers. "I told her to leave him," she sobbed. "I told her something wasn't right with him. He was controlling, obsessive. He didn't love her, he owned her." The officers exchanged glances. The same word kept coming up. Controlling. The kind of love that suffocates. The kind of love that turns deadly. More friends came forward with similar stories. Jamal had been jealous, possessive, explosive. He hated when Keisha talked to other guys, checked her phone, showed up unannounced when she went out with friends. But Keisha, kind-hearted and forgiving, always gave him the benefit of the doubt. He had a temper, another friend admitted. But he wasn't like that. I didn't think he was like that. One girl pulled up old text messages, ones Keisha had sent weeks before. Messages that hinted at her fear. Messages that painted a picture of a relationship spiraling into something dangerous. "I don't know what to do, Tasha. He gets mad over the smallest things. It's like I can't even breathe without setting him off. He says if I ever leave him, I'll regret it. Do you think he means it?" Those texts, once ignored, once brushed off as normal couple drama, now felt like a warning no one had taken seriously. As officers collected evidence, a crucial discovery was made. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. The grainy video showed Keisha and Jamal in the park that night. Their movements were tense. They were arguing. Keisha stepped back. Jamal stepped forward. And then, she turned to walk away. Moments later, he pulled out a gun. The detective's jaw tightened. It was enough. More than enough. Within the hour, an arrest warrant was issued for Jamal Carter. But when police arrived at his home, pounding on the door, calling out his name, there was no answer. The house was dark, empty. Jamal Carter was gone, and no one knew where he had disappeared to. Houston police moved fast. A crime this brutal, this personal, didn't just happen without leaving a trail. Jamal Carter was out there, somewhere, running. And every second that passed, every hour he remained free, the possibility of him disappearing for good grew stronger. Detectives retraced his steps, piecing together his movements after he fled the scene. They started with the obvious, his home. But Jamal hadn't gone back. His mother, shaken and pale, told officers she hadn't seen him, hadn't heard from him. "Did he call you?" the detective pressed. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "Number, but..." She hesitated. "He's scared of jail. He's scared of what'll happen to him if he gets caught. If he's out there, he's not coming home. Not unless he has to." That told them one thing. Jamal was going to ground. He had no intention of turning himself in. The search expanded. Police checked places he was known to frequent. Friends' houses, his old gym, the neighborhood basketball courts. Everywhere they went, the answer was the same. No sign of Jamal. Hours passed, then a full day, then 2. Houston police worked relentlessly, tracking his last known locations, pulling surveillance footage from nearby businesses, scanning ATM records, social media, anything that might give them a lead. Then, a breakthrough. A security camera caught a glimpse of him, just a brief flickering image, a gas station on the outskirts of town. He wasn't alone. A cousin, someone detectives had spoken to earlier, was with him. The timestamp? Less than 3 hours ago. The detective didn't hesitate. Bring the cousin in. Minutes later, officers were at his doorstep, pulling him in for questioning. He tried to play dumb at first, tried to shrug it off. "Man, I don't know where he is." But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation settled on him. And then, he cracked. Okay, he's hiding out. But he's scared, man. He don't know what to do." The detective leaned forward. "Where?" A long pause, then a single word. "The trap house." Every cop in the room knew exactly what he meant. An old, abandoned house in one of Houston's rougher neighborhoods. A place where squatters, drug dealers, and runaways sometimes holed up, hoping to stay off the radar. If Jamal was there, he wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. Within the hour, law enforcement moved in. The house sat at the end of a cracked, overgrown street, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in faded graffiti. A perfect hiding spot for someone who didn't want to be found. Officers approached with caution, weapons drawn. They could hear the faintest movement inside, a creak, a shuffle. "Jamal Carter!" The lead officer's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "We know you're in there. Come out now." Nothing. A tense pause. Hands tightened around triggers. Officers exchanged glances. Then, footsteps, slow, unsteady. The door creaked open. And there he was. Jamal Carter stepped into the dim light, his hands raised. His face was gaunt, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He looked nothing like the confident, charismatic athlete people once knew. This was a man who had spent 48 hours running, hiding, looking over his shoulder every second, waiting for the inevitable. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't resist. He just sank to his knees as officers swarmed him, yanking his arms behind his back, locking the cold steel of handcuffs around his wrists. "Jamal Carter, you're under arrest for the murder of Keisha Monroe." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time since that night, Jamal's face crumpled. It was over. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution stepped forward, methodically laying out the case against Jamal Carter. They weren't here to speculate. They weren't here to soften the blow. They were here to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Keisha Monroe's murder was not an accident, not a moment of passion, but a deliberate, cold-blooded execution. "This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence," the prosecutor said, his voice steady but firm. "This was premeditated. This was an ambush. Jamal Carter brought a gun to that park. He didn't snap, he planned this. He knew what he was going to do before he even pulled the trigger." Then came the autopsy report. The medical examiner took the stand, his tone clinical, detached, but his words landed like a hammer. 22 gunshot wounds, 22 shots fired, each one sealing Keisha's fate. Some at close range, some from a distance. It was overkill. It was fury. Keisha's mother clutched a tissue in her hand, staring straight ahead, expression unreadable. She had sat through every minute of the trial, refusing to look away, refusing to let her daughter's story be reduced to just another case file. But now, as the forensic details were laid bare, as the sheer brutality of what had happened was spoken out loud, she closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Just to breathe. And then, the sentence was read. Life in prison. Jamal Carter, once a promising young man, once a star athlete, once the boy Keisha had loved, was now an inmate. The gavel slammed down. And just like that, it was over. Because this case wasn't just about Jamal Carter. It wasn't just about Keisha Monroe. It was about something bigger, a problem that isn't talked about enough, a danger that lurks in relationships far too many young women find themselves trapped in. What warning signs did Keisha miss? What red flags were ignored? Could this tragedy have been prevented? Statistics show that intimate partner violence among teenagers is more common than most people think. 1 in 3 adolescents in the U.S. experiences some form of abuse in their romantic relationships, and in too many cases, it escalates, just like it did for Keisha Monroe. We've seen cases like this before. We will see cases like this again, unless we start recognizing the signs, unless we start taking them seriously. So now we ask you, what would you have done? If you were Keisha's friend, if you saw the warning signs, would you have spoken up? Would it have made a difference? And if you are in a relationship that feels controlling, that feels suffocating, that makes you scared, please don't wait until it's too late. Love should never cost your life. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, please seek help. There are resources available. You are not alone.